So, we're in this series on the Bloody Bible. A look at the parts of the Bible that make us cringe because of its violence, because of the dark feel, because of the seeming harshness, and the way it makes us question the very character of God. Which means this series cuts to the very heart of our faith. Maybe even whether to have faith to begin with. We started off with an overview of the Old Testament and the nature of God. And then building off of that last week, we looked at the punishments that we find in the Bible, including capital punishment. This week, we're going to look at the idea of sacrifice in the Bible, which puzzles a lot of people. And particularly that one story that is the most troubling to the most people. And it's captured in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. So let's look at it. It's in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1, where it says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham." Now let's stop there for a second, because it's important to understand this part before we even read another word. What was going on was that Abraham was being tested by God. Testing is about giving someone the opportunity to prove something, the opportunity to demonstrate something. When God tests someone, it's all about creating an opportunity for them to validate their choices, to flesh out their commitments. It's a situation that's given in order to show who they really are and what they really believe. And because of that, tests are important. Not only for the one doing the testing, but for the person being tested. So what kind of test did God have in mind for Abraham? Well, let's keep reading. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," Abraham replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Well, that's a little creepy and disturbing. Why, of all the tests, did God want Abraham to sacrifice his son? I mean, isn't that wrong? Isn't that warped? Maybe a little bent? Maybe even a little evil? What kind of God would put anyone up for that kind of test? Well, let's dig into it a little bit. Because there's much more here than meets the eye, beginning with the nature of the test itself. First, that God would use Isaac to test Abraham actually makes perfect sense. For Isaac was at the heart of Abraham's relationship with God. Here's the background. In that culture, in that time, a son was everything. Not only did they carry on your name, they carried on your family line, but tied up with them was everything you owned, everything you had built. If you died, it was your eldest son's responsibility to care for your widow and for your other children. All of the possessions went to the oldest son. Everything relied on that son. And if you didn't have a son, in that day, it was almost as if you didn't live. Like you hadn't lived at all. Or if you had lived, it was all for nothing. No legacy, no heritage, no future. Everything you had, your wife, your belongings, would just go to something and somebody else. That's not all. Abraham had been called by God prior to this to leave the country he was raised in, to leave his family, and to go to a completely foreign land, to some place God was taking him. And God told Abraham, if you'll do this, if you'll take this colossal leap of faith, then I'll make you into a nation. I'll make you a father of nations. In fact, he even changed Abraham's name. He used to be called Abram, which meant father of one. He changed his name to Abraham, which meant father of many. All that was tied up in Abraham's identity. Now more to the story. Abraham made that huge leap of faith and left his country, left his family, and resettled where God asked him to go. And then what's the first thing that happens? No kids. Fast forward a couple of years, still no kids. Fast forward even further, no kids. Abraham and Sarah had incredible fertility issues. They could not have children. Yet God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. You know when they had their first child? In their 90s. This was pre-Viagra. In their 90s. And then they got a single child. They got a son. And that son meant everything to them. Their future, God's promise, everything. So you can imagine the party they must have thrown. The way that their hearts were about to burst out of their chest. They had a son. It's all true. God really is there. He was telling them the truth. He's faithful. Life is good. And then all of a sudden, God says, okay, time for test number 2. Give up your son. It's as if God was saying, you had faith, Abraham, that I would give you a son. Do you have faith that no matter what happens to that son, I'll still fulfill my promise to you? Do you have enough faith for that? If I take your son's life, do you believe I'm still faithful to that life that I promised you that you were going to live? Now you're probably thinking that while it might be okay for God to test our hearts, this is another human being. The very life of his only son. That's not a test. That's insane. The taking of a life? Now, before we go any further, let's just talk about the taking of a life in relation to God for a second. Was it really so scandalous? Let's think about it in terms of what's really going on here. Yes, the pagan ritual of child sacrifice by humans was condemned throughout the Bible and condemned by God himself. And murder is wrong because we do not have the right to take a life. Only God has that right. But that's the twist, isn't it? Only God has that right. And this was God exercising that right. When God takes a life or commands its taking, it's not murder. Because he created that life. He gave that life. It's his to do with it as he pleases. And here, God is exercising that right. And it was his to exercise. There's something that's really hard for us in this idea. Because we're so self-absorbed, and God is so distant in our lives that we have a hard time grasping this. We don't treat him as God. And oftentimes we don't think of him as God. But here's the truth. Isaac was not Abraham's entire life. Isaac's life wasn't even Isaac's. We all belong to God. We were created by him. Isaac's role on this planet was God's to determine. And whatever length of days or the role his life took, that was a God thing. If God wanted to return him to death, that was God's choice. Nothing immoral about it. Whether God took that life at 6 days, 6 years, 60 years, or 600 years, it was God's choice. It would be immoral for us to make that decision, but not for God. That's what it means to be God. But that's not all there is to the story. So let's keep reading. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When they had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Now there are three things that are essential to take note of here. First, Abraham had absolute faith that Isaac would not die. Even if he went through with the sacrifice, he believed God would somehow raise him back up. Did you notice the words on the front end? Let's read them again. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. We will come back to you. Not I, but we. Not maybe, but will." Abraham believed in the absolute goodness and faithfulness of God. And then second, so did Isaac. Isaac asked about the land. Abraham said that God would provide. And for Isaac, that was enough. We're told in Scripture that Isaac was old enough and he was big enough to carry and strap on all the wood for that offering. That would have been heavy. He was grown. He was strong. Isaac was big enough and strong enough to do that, and his father was probably by that time in his hundreds. So it wouldn't have been a contest if Isaac had decided not to cooperate. There's no indication, though, that Isaac fought his father when being bound, or that he tried to run away from his father, or that he even fought for his life. A fight that Isaac likely would have won. Even as the knife was raised, Isaac was as trusting as his father was. It wasn't just Abraham's test. It was also Isaac's test. In fact, in Jewish culture, there's the idea that when you talk about submitting to God, it's binding yourself to Him. They use the language of binding yourself over to God, and it's a direct tie back to this story, where Isaac willingly allowed himself to be bound, knowing what was about to take place. And then third, God did provide. He did intervene. God never intended for Abraham to sacrifice his son. It was a test. But it showed God everything. So how did the story end? It still ended with the sacrifice. So let's finish reading the story. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of your enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Now that we have sighed a collective sigh of relief, we're not done though. Because there's still a larger question of why God cares about sacrifices after all. We get the test, but why did the ram even have to be sacrificed? Wasn't the test in and of itself enough? And how does that all play out today? So let me see if I can give you my best shot at walking through this. And hopefully it'll connect some dots that really need to be connected. They need to be connected if we're going to understand the Bible, if we're going to understand God's whole redemptive plan, and what this whole Christian thing is all about. It's important territory, and it can be a little bit deep, so I'm trusting you had your coffee this morning. So let's just jump into it, because we've got to go back and work our way forward to see it. To get to it, we need to go back to one of the greatest figures in the Bible, in Bible history. A man named Moses, in an event known as the Passover. There was a time many centuries ago when the Jewish people were enslaved by the Egyptians. And a man by the name of Moses came along and he led them out of captivity with the help of a God-delivered plague or two, out of bondage and into freedom. It took 10 plagues from God before the stubborn hearts of the Egyptians would release the Jewish slaves. God didn't want to send the plagues. He didn't enjoy the plagues. But he loves us too much to not do everything that he can to get our attention, to turn us around. And God was not only showing his love for the Jews, he was trying to reach out to the Egyptians as well, and to try to soften their hearts, but they wouldn't respond. So each plague grew in gravity and force, one after the other, having no effect. 9 didn't do the job. And so the 10th and decisive plague was the most telling of all, and would result in the death of the firstborn in Egypt. But like all the others, it could have been avoided. God told the Israelites if they would sacrifice an unblemished lamb, one without a defect, perfect in every way, and then take the blood from that lamb and spread it on their doorposts of their homes, when the angel of death that was being sent to deliver the 10th and final plague, that angel would see the blood and he would pass over their house. Hence the term, Passover. You see, in ancient times, the Bible teaches that God allowed people to sacrifice an animal to make amends for their own sins. That seems strange to us today, but it was very intentional by God. He wanted people to see the severity of their sins. He wanted people to see that paying for the sin that comes between us and him, that payment was messy. That payment was gruesome. And it was costly. Because sin is messy and gruesome and costly. But he also wanted us to see his love, his forgiveness, and his mercy. So the sacrifice was a substitute for the sinner. It bore the sinner's guilt, which is where we get our term scapegoat You've heard of making someone the scapegoat for something, blaming them, pinning something on them. The term comes from the Bible. The Israelites had an annual Day of Atonement on which the Old Testament priest made atonement for all the sins committed by everyone in the community. The scapegoat was a goat to which the sins of the Israelites were symbolically transferred on this day. And then it was driven out into the wilderness. There would be a laying on of hands representing a confession of guilt on the part of the people, and a transfer of the guilt from the people to the scapegoat. God also said that the animal sacrifice, were to be without any kind of blemish or mark. The point was that sin, that imperfection, can only be addressed by perfection, by God himself. Because the sin was ultimately against him, was against his law, and only he could offer true forgiveness. It wasn't something that they or we could address ourselves. So the sacrifice was offered to God. But it wasn't something that would finally and ultimately bridge that gap between man and God. It was like a stopgap measure, as God was trying to make his redemptive plan clear. Which is why throughout that time, the great prophets of God said that there would be one who would come from God, one who would take away the sins of the world once and for all. The one sacrifice for all. The Messiah was coming. But that could happen. Anyone who wanted to make the sacrifice, anyone who wanted to fill it with the meaning that it was meant to have and make it known, would be passed over. Whether they were Jewish, whether they were Egyptian, they all had the same opportunity. It was wide open for anyone wanting God's mercy. Unfortunately, the people of Egypt would not release the Jewish people from slavery. They did not turn to the one true God for mercy. Even after seeing all of the plagues unleashed on their land, and all that had happened to them, they didn't turn to God. So the angel came. The firstborn of Egypt were killed. And those who had covered their homes with the blood of the Lamb were saved. And it had such an impact on the leaders of Egypt that they finally released the Israelites from slavery. Jews have been celebrating the festival of the Passover ever since, as a reminder of God's deliverance, his deliverance from death, and the freedom that came from that deliverance. And that deliverance came based on the sacrifice of a lamb like this one. A lamb like that one would be sacrificed. The festival developed and eventually involved a lamb that would be slaughtered and eaten. It would be the main meal. The lamb would be the main meal. And unleavened bread made without yeast. That would be eaten so that that bitter taste would remind them of the bitterness of the slavery that the blood had released them from. And interestingly enough, a cup of wine was always set aside as part of the Passover celebration. It was set at the table, but it was never drunk. You see, that setting was for the one they looked forward to, the promised Messiah. It was set just in case the Messiah came that very night to bring deliverance. The cup was symbolically there. In case the Messiah were to come, there would be a place for him at their table. And there would be a cup for him at their table. And finally, it was always to be celebrated as a family, as part of a wider faith community. So what does this have to do with us and sacrifices today? For that part of the story, we need to turn to the New Testament. Just before his death, Jesus gathered the disciples together to celebrate the Passover. But something happened. This was right before his death on the cross, when they gathered in that upper room to have the Last Supper. But something happened. So let's read it in Luke chapter 22. I'm moving my clicker the wrong side. It said, Jesus took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Do you realize how electric that must have been to the disciples in that upper room? How it would have blown them all away. Because Jesus said to them, "Now this wine and this bread is to have a new meaning. It's to represent me as the unblemished lamb that was sacrificed. And those who are marked by my blood will be freed from the slavery of their sin and will be passed over from the spiritual death that comes from sin." Jesus said, "From now on, do this in remembrance of me." This is the new memorial. Replace the Passover. There's a new memorial meal for those who are now a part of the family of God. The bread is to be eaten, but in remembrance of his body that will be broken for us. And there's to be wine as a symbol of blood, but his blood shed on the cross. And the cup set aside for the Messiah at the Passover meal is now to be raised to your lips. For Jesus says, "He has come." Can you imagine being in that room when all that came out? How mind-blowing that would have been. Jesus was informing them that now he was the true sacrificial lamb. That his death would now serve as the deliverance of God's people from their sin. Jesus was saying that God was calling his people out of a deeper slavery than ever existed under the Egyptians. He's calling them out of the very slavery of sin, the slavery we all suffer with. And he is calling them into a new community in relationship with the living God. Through Jesus, the Passover had reached its ultimate fulfillment and celebration. Everything that started with Moses and the Exodus, everything that the Passover meal looked forward to, had now been fulfilled. Jesus was the second Isaac, that ultimate sacrifice for the world. that his Father didn't withhold. The ultimate sacrifice that was provided. And ever since that moment, the celebration of the Lord's Supper has been one of the church's most sacred acts. Sometimes it's called communion. Jesus said, "Will you take and eat?" He said, "Will you take and drink? And will you remember what I did for you?" So that's what's up with the sacrifice. That's what's up with this famous story of Abraham and Isaac. We don't need animal sacrifices anymore because Jesus was that perfect, unblemished lamb and took the sacrifice upon himself. There's an old hymn that I like that says, "What can wash away my sins? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus." Oh, precious is that flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Our eyes can become so closed to this, and we can take it for granted. We can stop seeing the incredible act that was done on our behalf, the incredible gift that was given to each of us. So take a moment and remember. Open the eyes of your heart. Open them to the cross of Jesus.